What's up, guys? So today I want to talk a little bit more about UEFI, firmware backdoors, and just supply chain backdoors in general. I figured this would be a good place to head to since we recently talked about the pager attacks and how supply chain has vulnerabilities in that way. That these pagers could have been either interdicted, as they call it, to intercept a package and to replace the contents of it, or to modify what's in a given package before it reaches the destination with a backdoor, or otherwise similar to how we saw with the pager attack. And it seemed like a good place to start. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about this firmware that's stored on your motherboard. So modern day, it's called UEFI. It's a Unified Extensible Firmware Interface. So this is something that is predecessor was BIOS, basic input output. It's stored in your hardware before you even buy it. This is firmware that loads before your operating system, and that makes it much harder to detect as well. Basically, anything that you run on your computer can be completely compromised if this firmware has a backdoor to begin with. Now, this backdoor could be inserted at various points in the supply chain, and if you missed it, I actually talk about this in the past, and 2022 was one of those posts. I also made another one with new updates, and in the last year there have been a few UEFI backdoors discovered on brand new hardware. So that's a huge concern, of course, and why I wanted to talk about it today. So this is PKfail, which is a vulnerability, a backdoor basically. It could be considered a backdoor, but it's not necessarily a proven backdoor because it offers plausible deniability. If it were a backdoor, I'm not claiming it is, but what seems to be a common case is where they have things like test passwords or test logins. PKfail, which actually relies on a secure private key. So what it uses, and it was related to American Megatrends, which is another part of the supply chain that is involved in this UEFI firmware. There's secure boot, which, if you're not familiar, it is something that is meant to ensure that you're loading up the right operating system, that is not some kind of backdoored system, that it protects your boot basically. And what happened was, in this particular case, they had a key that was meant to be replaced. It was meant to be disabled, but several computer manufacturers failed to change this key. And it even said, it was even labeled, do not use this key. It was even called that. So really, did they forget? Yeah, they could have forgotten. Basically allowed it to bypass secure boot altogether. So it talks about that, and secure boot completely broken in 200 plus different models from 5 big device manufacturers. Keep in mind, this is 2024. This is this year. So I have multiple stories from this year where they have discovered these doors. I'll call them doors because we don't know if they're purposely put in or if they were just forgotten about and meant to be disabled. Secure boot, as we know, was something meant to protect your boot and your operating system, but this UEFI firmware loads before your operating system. And basically, this vulnerability, as it's called, it provides an unlimited secure boot bypass. So it's able to actually bypass it because of the key that was supposed to not still be there. But for some reason, it was. The issuer of this key says do not trust. So American Megatrends, which is AMI here. Secure boot in a nutshell, if you're curious about it, it uses platform keys, which is the PKfail, stands for platform key fail, and that provides the root of trust anchor in the form of the cryptographic key that is embedded into the firmware. So this all works together to safely load and establish that trust between the operating system and the firmware itself. So this is something that is meant to prevent attacks, but in this particular case, it makes it appear to still be secure. When this is exploited, you can actually check secure boot and it'll still show secure boot as secure. And they have a large list of different models that are affected by this, and most people don't update their firmware as they should. That's just another reminder today to update your firmware. And this was around for a while. So a couple of these that we're talking about today, and you can check out my other video on BitChute talking about hardware backdoors discovered, so root or such. computer hardware backdoors, and we talk about things like the Intel Management Engine interface. We can take a look at another example of a UEFI bootkit, and a bootkit is something that is going to remain persistent. And this is the key point. If I were interested in backdooring computers on a mass scale, the supply chain is exactly what I would be interested in. I would be interested in infiltrating some part of that supply chain to get modifications passed into the code that would allow it to be leveraged into some kind of external access. And we're also going to talk a little bit about that today. So that's an example of a bootkit as well. Now, another backdoor, or I guess you want to call it a testing key or a testing thing. So these are also UEFI related firmware flaw. Now they're mentioning Intel chips, but it's really the firmware itself that is vulnerable. And what this one is essentially a buffer overflow in the firmware's TPM module configuration, which allows the attacker to escalate the privileges and gain code execution within the UEFI firmware runtime. And as mentioned, this comes on right before, this is what's responsible for loading up everything into your operating system and all. So this is before the operating system actually loads. And some of these others, including Cosmic Strand, another one that is similar. And really, this is the key point to put a backdoor if you're going to put a backdoor in. So once one of these is compromised, if this PKfail or otherwise, you can load it and turn it into any kind of backdoored operating system you want, while still having it look like secure boot is still enabled and still looks secure.
Today we want to discuss PKfail. PKfail is very interesting incident because it connects so many different pieces where the software supply chain.
So like he says, it connects so many different pieces of the supply chain and the risks there. Here's another example. This was a Black Hat talk this year in August. So you've already been hacked. What if there's a backdoor in your UEFI firmware, OROM? Now here is a visual for you, the page I was looking for. This is the components of the supply chain. So we have all of these different segments, all of these different links in the supply chain that all come together to make up the UEFI firmware, which is stored on your flash chip that is on your motherboard. And it's also stored on various types of devices, including your router as well. So different devices can be compromised. And if you wanted to backdoor on a mass scale, this is exactly where you'd hit. You would hit the supply chain. You would hit the supply chain, and that would ensure that even if they reinstall the operating system, even if they remove all of the storage, even if they change out most of those hardware parts, that is still going to be on the board because it is stored in a flash chip. All of these have to be trusted parties. With open source, the beauty in open source is you have transparency. If you can understand how the code works, how the hardware works with the code, you can basically see what it's doing. But when you have things like hidden actions, which you have proprietary stuff on your computer, in your computer, all of those things are basically a black box. I pulled up the Superfish as well, which is something I went over in the past. Now Superfish, this is an older one, but it was a BIOS backdoor. It is the firmware that loads well before the operating system. It is the firmware that has privileges over the entire operating system, so you're not going to be able to bypass that unless you completely replace that firmware that is problematic. So you can't just remove your storage. You can't install, well, in the case of Superfish, it's a little different because this backdoor firmware that is Superfish was actually working specifically with Windows operating systems. And we can even learn more when we take a look at some of the releases of those leaks that are now public and published by journalists. So this is all public at this point. This is on the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Now you can see that the targeting of BIOS, motherboard, UEFI is the #1 interest. in those who are interested in doing things like collection or doing things like backdoors. It's going to be the BIOS, it's going to be the UEFI firmware, it's going to be the flash chip that's going to be modified. Because in that case, even if something piece of hardware was on its way to its destination, it could be intercepted or interdicted, and then it could be reflashed with a clone, something that looks and acts exactly the same, except for it may have some additional stuff on it, something that can leverage access. Like in this particular case, we have this Iron Chef one, which, as I mentioned, this is now public information. So this actually exploits the backdoor in the motherboard, the BIOS, and also it uses hardware implant for RF or radio frequency communication, which means it can be a wireless backdoor. And how would that work? Well, how can you make your motherboard wireless? Well, by itself, you necessarily, might have the hardware built in. But there's ways it could be used in concert with something like a Wi-Fi card. So you can take a look at Bad BIOS, which is another report that was about a backdoor in BIOS. Now, I'm not suggesting that these backdoors come on all brand new computers, but I am wondering, and I am, very suspicious about what comes on brand new computers, especially in the modern age when we think about backdoors. Are they getting less advanced? No, they're going to be using the latest and greatest studies and research to implement the most covert backdoor possible, and to also leverage it in a way that makes it appear that it is doing normal actions. So it's going to be even more difficult to discover today than it was in times past. And it may work with other pieces of hardware. So in that way, it could be working with a PCI card, it could be working with something else in order to basically allow for that wireless exploitation as mentioned here. So it may not be on its own. And most likely today, given all of the research into this, it's likely going to be used in concert with other things. So there may be problem in the, UEFI firmware supply chain, but then also maybe a issue and a backdoor or a partial backdoor in maybe the wireless card. The core boot laptops that I do offer all have a Wi-Fi card change. Because as mentioned, right on the documents that are now public, talks about two-way RF communication. Well, in order to do that, you got to have some kind of wireless device to do that. Well, your Wi-Fi card, which unfortunately for most people is going to be locked in. It is whitelisted, so what that means is on most computers you're going to have the problem of trying to change that Wi-Fi card. Now, one step you could take is simply remove the internal Wi-Fi card altogether and use an external USB Wi-Fi card. And in that way you have a choice when you want it to be active or accessible to that UEFI firmware or whatever problem you may have on your system. So that is a on-demand type of setup you could use, which is removing the Wi-Fi card. Then maybe you'll want to actually add only a USB Wi-Fi card, and that would prevent any kind of Wi-Fi based attack, at least in this context. So we can go down here and see more of them, and as you look through these papers and you see, now this is a great resource. This is not, suggesting that this comes on brand new computers. We don't have any knowledge to support that. What we do know is that there are types of situations where packages could be intercepted and then replaced with something with a backdoor possibly. And this could be from, it could be Russia doing this, it could be China, it could be Israel, it could be Europe, it could be US, it could be anywhere along that supply chain. Potentially there could be people working on the inside, could potentially have, some type of support system to inject this type of thing into the hardware itself. And, that's the real danger here. That's why I'm talking about the supply chain on this, because, it just relates directly to our recent report where we've talked about how the Israeli likely may have intercepted those pagers to replace them with something else that was more malicious. Well, in the same way that we talked about that, we can talk about the UEFI and the firmware itself, the UEFI firmware that could be interdicted, could be replaced, and technically, if there were people on the inside, it could happen even at the origin, the factory itself. So there's no telling, if there's an additional thing on your system, especially if you only understand how to change your operating systems, how to change your storage contents. If you don't have, some familiarity with where you're sourcing your hardware, you need to find an honest supplier, somebody that you think you can trust, which could be anyone. It could be System 76, could be Purism, could be Pine 64, could be, any number of companies, could be NitroPad, NitroKey Company. There's so many different options out there that offer core boot based hardware that will have more transparency in action. Because as we can see, some of these publicized documents talk about this God mode malware that is found in the firmware on the motherboard. So when you take a look at that, you have to really wonder, at what point does it make it to the motherboard? Is it in transit? Is it somewhere on that supply chain list? One thing we do know is there is a preference to go towards the UEFI firmware, no matter who the actor is. No matter who the actor is, the UEFI firmware is going to be the number one target just because it's unremovable. It's unremovable, and in that way, it is going to be much easier. And as you can see, it talks about how it works in concert, this particular piece of malware that can work in concert with a custom PCI add-on card named Bulldozer in this case. Now, this goes for any country. Every Intel or corporation or contractor that has an interest in gathering information, things like that, could be working potentially with various other parties in the supply chain and could work together. So you may only be able to inspect part of it, or you may be inspecting just part of it, and you may not find the key to a backdoor just because it needs the other part. So as mentioned, it could be a codependency, it could be a backdoor, and most likely would be a backdoor that leverages multiple pieces of the system, be it hardware, be it software, as with some of the other options that we talked about, like the operating system working in concert with Superfish, which was a more early example here. But today, it's more likely that it would be possibly two pieces of hardware working together. Another example here, we can talk about Intel Management Engine and how it requires certain versions of Intel cards to function properly. So there's a lot of different options out there, but what we do know is that we know that it prefers to target the BIOS. No matter who the actor is, whatever country they're from, targeting the BIOS, the chip on the motherboard, that's the flash chip, that is exactly what's replaced when you have a core boot laptop. So this kind of thing can be fixed in some cases, and in other cases you're going to have to find a clean source of the stock or proprietary BIOS. And some of these pages are old, but the things I'm also sharing with you guys today also include some of these backdoors from this year, or vulnerabilities from this year, whichever you prefer to use, whatever word you prefer to use. Now let's take another look. Since we got through that hardware part, let's take a look at another supply chain issue. Here is malware that infiltrated Pigeon Messenger's official plugin repository, and it actually had keyloggers on it, information stealers and malware, to gain access to corporate networks. Interesting. And it was on the Off the Record. I used to use Off the Record. This plugin is basically the predecessor to what is today's Signal. So earlier, Moxie, Marlinspike started out with Off the Record and Redphone, and those were ways to encrypt your messages using various chat protocols, even AOL Instant Messenger at one point. And using this plugin would allow you to encrypt it, and it was called off the record. Well, somebody has put a malicious code into that plugin, and it basically has affected people with something called Darkgate malware. So some of this was meant to capture screens and do various other things. I haven't used off the record in a very long time, but it just shows that the supply chain, however you want to look at that, is very vulnerable to these types of attacks. Now here in another story, in our final story, we're going to talk about how the revival hijack of supply chain threatens 22,000 Python library packages. So this is another big threat in the supply chain that ends up as the eventual software on your computer. So all the different applications you have, it is most likely they are all using some various libraries from different sources. Now these libraries, they also can be infiltrated just like the hardware supply chain, just like that UEFI firmware supply chain that we talked about earlier. The Python packages, any Python application that is using up to these 22,000 Python packages. So what happens is they're using something called a revival hijack, and that's what that means is after packages or libraries were deleted, they register under the same name, and in that way they can then use the previous reputation of those packages and then insert that malicious code into them. Someone has deleted some package and maybe it had a great reputation but it got deleted. Well, then somebody in an example could simply create one of the same name. So then it appears to be the same creator, and in that point, if it has a strong reputation, you're going to get a lot of people downloading it. So that's another attack here that can happen, and it has been a serious problem with Python libraries. Is we have seen this in just the last couple years that they've shown how several of them had malicious code in them. So you have to be careful if you're using any Python libraries. You're going to need to understand that you are implementing the code in those libraries. If somebody put malicious code into it, it could very well break the encryption of an encryption library, things along that nature. So that's what I wanted to talk about today, guys. Make sure to follow over at the blog. You can follow over on I2P at righttoprivacy.i2p, and you can also follow on the ClearNet. If you want to follow on the ClearNet, go to bmc.link/politictech. It's free to follow. You can follow all the posts there, and you can read. The majority of them are fully public posts. Now, occasionally I do give some things out in advance to people who support this with a membership. So if you want to support this with a membership, you can also go over to the membership, and it's a great way to show your support. Another great way to show your support, and really the best way to support this, is to share these videos and posts everywhere. Really appreciate your help doing that. And if you're interested in a core boot laptop that doesn't have the vulnerabilities of UEFI firmware backdoors, well, you can check that out as well over at the commission section, and that is for, at this time of this video, for the lower 48 US states. Just because of the complications, I haven't worked out international, but appreciate all your guys' support. Let me know in the comments what you think. Do you think modern hardware has backdoors? Do you think all computers today have backdoors? What do you think about those new AI chips, the NPUs that are coming in new computers? Do you think those could assist a backdoor? Because it certainly does appear that a lot of the latest trends, like to actually take screenshots like Copilot and to actually check on the actual cryptographic hashes to try and detect different types of files on your computer, they say to protect kids. Do you think that's really the only use, or do you think there's going to be a supply chain issue there as well? Let me know what you guys think in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts below, and I'll be back later with more on how to protect your security and privacy.